So welcome everyone. I'm so happy to see all of you here for our afternoon session. I have a bio statement for Dr. Deyhle, but let me read it first and then I'm going to tell you what she really means to me. Okay, so Dr. Deyhle was an assistant professor at the University of Utah in the College of Education when she started her ethnographic research in the 1980s in San Juan School District, Utah. She was trying to understand why so many Native youth left school before graduation and hoped that this knowledge could be used to more effectively train teachers to serve the needs of their Native students. She discovered that academic courses opening a path to college were invisible in most schools. Vocational education was the only path provided for Native students. Many teachers were indifferent to the lives of their Native students. Teachers' knowledge of the Navajo community was framed by racism and limited expectations constrained by a history of colonization. Over the years, Dr. Deyhle watched and listened to the educational encounters Navajo youth were experiencing and talking about. They spoke clearly about what helped them to excel in school, cultural and linguistic reaffirmation, the desire for an appreciation of who they are, high teacher skills and performance, and highly engaged curriculum. Very little of this existed in their schools. From the start of her research, she had been layered with many different roles, including scholar, teacher, friend, foe, ethical researcher, unethical researcher, expert witness, and breakdancer. In this presentation, Dr. Deyhle will focus on her role as an expert witness in the Sinigini et al. Versus San Juan School District, very similar to the Yazzie Martinez versus State of New Mexico. This case, started by Navajo parents in 1975, focused on the unequal educational opportunities experienced by their children. Almost 50 years later, the court still retains its jurisdiction, meaning the district must provide equal educational opportunity over time that assures to the court that equal educational opportunity exists. This is still to be determined. Oh God, we could be talking about Yazzie Martinez, right?
Right.
On a personal note, Dr. Deyhle was really important to me as a doctoral student in my own research. She did critical ethnography, which I did. I did critical ethnography in my book, Native Pride. I had the pleasure of interviewing her on a phone interview, asking her about her work, and that's how we got to know each other. I think it was in 1995. I got to know her, and she worked very closely with the late Ruth Trinidad Galvan, and Ruth was a very important faculty member here at UNM. And I will say that most of my students read your work one way or another. And just want to tell you that we're really happy that you're here and you have roots here in Albuquerque, and I'll let you speak to that.
Wow, well, I'm really honored to be here. What a distinguished group of people. And I'm really flattered that my research seems to have made a difference. And, you know, as scholars, we always wonder, are we going to write something and nobody's ever going to read it and it's not going to make a difference? And when your heart is in activism, you really want to make a difference. And I'm going to talk today about what I tried to do and what didn't quite work out in the kind of the course, the path of my academic life. So I need to take you all the way back for a few minutes to my own graduate education, which was at UNM. And at the time, I was one of the very first anthropology and ed students at UNM. It was almost 50 years ago. Every time I say that, I go, I can't be that old, but it was almost 50 years ago. In the development of the field of educational anthropologists, one of the things that we were trying to do is move the discourse away from a deficit discourse that was fueled at that time by psychology, to move it into pulling the expertise of anthropologists to use the word difference, not deficit. So we were looking at cultural differences instead of the jargon, again, of a negative portrait of failure, but trying to look at, in the case of education, that cultural differences lead you to learn things differently and learn to express them differently. So after I started as an assistant professor, one of my own students was an elementary school teacher in Bluff, Utah. And he talked about, in the literature that I had been reading, talked about how we may know most of the research had been done on elementary school kids, Native kids, and very little in the high schools. So I was invited in at that time. I'm not invited in San Juan County anymore, and you'll know after I talk about it. But at that time, I was embraced to come into the high school and look at the high dropout rate and try to understand what's going on. How can I train teachers, or how can we in departments of education train teachers to be more effective in working with Native kids? And the only study that I entered into in high school, or in my own research, came from the Waxes, and they had studied the high school youth in Sioux, but the youth that dropped out of school, the schools that used the label dropouts. But when the anthropologists interviewed these youth, they didn't use dropout, they used kicked out and pushed out, which really leads us to look at structural, institutional things, not something on the level of cultural things. So when I went in, I found a huge amount of racial conflict, which I've written about. In my article in Harvard Ed, I talk about racial warfare and cultural warfare. And that was a very uncomfortable, to just give you a little point. The editors at Harvard Ed did not want to use that language. They wanted me to use cultural differences. And from what I saw, the underlying tension in San Juan County, I could not utilize a language that didn't express what I was seeing. So right from the beginning, and I'm going to step back to get the Sinigine case in here. So I started my research in San Juan High School in 1984. And one of the first documents I was given, and I'm going to hold it up, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It's this, whoops, yeah. This was a bilingual, bicultural plan, educational design, and it was given to me by the Resource Center in Blanding. And I carried this around with me. And for 3-4 years, I didn't find a single teacher that had even seen this. And then I found that this document was being used every 6 months. San Juan School District was saying to the courts that they were in compliance and that this was being used in the district. When I was given this plan, I was clearly told by the director of the Resource Center that in it, what's unique about this plan is it talks about language and culture being exposed to all students in San Juan County, which meant white students as well as the Native students, that white students would have cultural understanding of their peers in the classroom. It wasn't just for Native students. It was not supposed to be a fringe document that was an add-on multicultural document, but it was supposed to be part of the curriculum. And it was invisible. I never saw it. The director told me that there was a reason it wasn't used. And the reason it was not used was because of the reluctance of the white parents to have their students exposed to something that was really insignificant and not important. Okay. So when I started looking back, how did this document come about? And that got me into researching the Sinigine case. And the Sinigine case is very important, as it started in 1974, where Navajo parents complained, and it was a federal class action suit that their sons and daughters were not provided equitable educational opportunities. And one was access to school. So at that time, all of the schools were in the northern part of the county, where the Navajo population is primarily in the southern part of the county. And although not having a language program was part of the lawsuit, a bigger part was the distance that young Native students had to travel to get to schools. And I just want to share this to you because it's kind of shocking if you are not aware of some of the things that I've written about in the past. So this is in one, so the case revolved around the long distances Navajo children had to travel to attend high school. In one, Navajo students were bused up to 166 miles round trip each day, 166. And another, Navajo students were bused for as long as 112 miles round trip each day. So the 220 Navajo high school students who were bused by the district rode on the bus an average of 86 miles each day of the school year. The average Navajo student traveled 4 times as far to school as did the average non-Indian student. So each year on average, and this is the number that always strikes me, Navajo students traveled more than 15,000 miles, spending the equivalent of 120 school days physically sitting on a bus to attend school. For students at the end of the longest bus ride, the figure rode to 30,000 miles each year and 240 school days on buses. And as we all know in this session, roads were rutted, eroded, unpaved, and frequently washed out during rain. So the suit brought to the public schools to the part of the Navajo Nation where none had previously existed. So the Navajo parents succeeded in this lawsuit, and 2 high schools were constructed. White Horse High School in 1978 and Monument Valley High School in 1983. And when you look at the educational experiences of the white kids as well as the access, the Native kids, white children had access to public schools 60 years before Native kids had to. Even though the Native kids might be living in a town, in Blanding, there was the effort to send them to boarding schools, but not wanting them in to the public schools. And I could go on a lot of the discourses that the white community gave about why Indian students shouldn't be sitting next to their children, but I don't want to slide into such a negative model. But the idea that we shouldn't only be looking at the negative, we need to look more positively. So I won't give the white explanations because they are very horrific and untrue. So the schools were built, and the second part of the lawsuit dealt with the bilingual bicultural plan that I just showed you. Navajo parents, rightly so, were arguing that their lives, their culture, their language should not be invisible in the curriculum when almost half of the students in San Juan County were Native. And as I found, even though the plan was on paper in the district libraries, but it was not in teachers' classrooms. I started my work in '84. Around 1990, parents decided, looking at test scores, students are testing in the 10th percentile in math and reading. Parents decided that the schools were miseducating their children. They were not doing what they should, that their students should be academically on the same level as the white peers. And so they decided to bring the suit again. So in 1991, the case had never been closed, but it was opened up again. And the plaintiffs were the children of the original lawsuit. And at this point, I had been sitting in the classrooms as an anthropologist. I was becoming a high school dropout myself. The classes were demeaning, they were boring. The classes in the 2 new high schools, Whitehorse and Monument Valley, primarily had at that time vocational ed courses. The director of curriculum stated very clearly to me that they know what's best for their Native students and they do good in vocational ed. They don't do well in the academics. So with pride, Whitehorse High School was defined as a state-of-the-art vocational ed. And even for students, and this tells you the limitations that were put on with this kind of curriculum, that in 90, the valedictorian of the high school, top of the class, could not get into the University of Utah because the student didn't have the science and the math requirements because they weren't provided at the high school. At this point, I shifted my role from a cultural anthropologist to an applied anthropologist and to an expert witness in the Senegini case. It also shifted, as you might imagine, my access to the schools at this point because I became a trader and no longer was a neutral ethnographer. And of course, I think all of us here in the room know that there's really no such thing as this neutral scientist that is touted in the literature. At this time, also, under Janet Reno's office in the Department of Justice intervened in this case. And so the Office for Civil Rights was involved and they came to Utah, interviewed me, and I started working on providing information from my ethnographic research to show unequitable access to academic courses, looking at just the institutional structures that are race-based, that were depriving Navajo and Ute students of equal educational opportunities. It was also kind of a turning point for me on the faculty, because once I made this decision, the San Juan School District was not happy. And their lawyers subpoenaed me and demanded my field notes. And this is a lesson that I later made sure that my students knew. You keep 2 sets of field notes. There are things that have no business in a court of law. They have no business, even for the anthropologist to have written down and have documented, when it could come to severe harm for the young people, and in my case, the young students I was writing about. And the subpoena, our side was very upset with the way the subpoena was delivered. And it was delivered to me while I was teaching. I was teaching my anthropology and ed course, and the knock on the door. And it actually made me like a superstar among the students. It was one of a kind of a frightening experience. It turned into a very empowering one for me as a professor, knowing that this was the right thing to do. I was very happy I had tenure because the district wrote to the university, to the College of Ed, to my dean, and accused me of shoddy research, and this line I always hang on to, of causing social unrest because I was discussing racism. First thing my chair asked, do you have have you done your IRB? Do you have institutional approval for the research? And I did. The state of Utah was, the Attorney General's office became my legal counsel in this case. And anyway, it was resolved out of court in 1991. And I just admire the Navajo parents so much for them being so persistent not to give up. And in an out-of-court settlement, there were 4 committees that were created, and there were 3 members from the Navajo Nation side and 3 members from the school district side on each of these committees. And I was assigned, there was a heritage language committee, special ed committee, curriculum committee, and a finance committee. I was put on the curriculum committee, and we spent 2 years trying to create a new curriculum that would integrate, again, not having Navajo, in this case, Navajo history and culture sidelined as something that's an addendum to the real curriculum, but that it be infused throughout. And most importantly, that it be part of the curriculum that non-Native students, the white students, would also be required to have. If we're talking about trying to reduce racial tensions, we need to know who who people are. Over a 4-year period, we worked, and I was the only one in the group who was not paid by the Justice Department to do this work. Not that I couldn't have used the money as an assistant professor or beginning associate professor, but I considered it service. And I also then did not have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I made the decision that what I found, and if it could be used to make a difference, I wanted to be able to talk about it. So in the 4 years, we created a curriculum, and I say we, there were people, Wayne Holm was on the committee for the heritage language, and Dan McLaughlin. Those were the 2 key individuals from our side. A beautiful language program was created. We had access, students had access to, in the elementary school, from 1st grade through 12th grade, with parent consent, they could take Navajo, they had access to Navajo language classes, Navajo history classes, and Navajo cultural classes. And the language it was a small amount of time, but it was consistent. And during this time, we, as a team, decided that we needed monitoring. The district, just the fact that this court case started in 1974, and when I started in 84, and teachers had not even seen the curriculum, meant that something wasn't trickling down. So we did 2 visits each year. We would do a fall visit, and we would do a visit in the spring. And the one thing that we insisted on was that we wanted to physically be there. We wanted to be in the classrooms, and it was a big fight. And we were later seen as intruders, pushing our will on innocent teachers. And let me say, there were some excellent teachers in San Juan County, and some that should not have been teaching. They should be elevator operators. But in the course of that 4 years in our monitoring, we saw some positive changes. Again, the language was there, the classes were offered in culture and language. But as a new administration came in, the Bush administration came in, the district decided that they wanted to get out of the monitoring, that they felt that we were intrusive. Right at the point we were starting to see some positive change. And in our visits at the beginning and the end of the year, we would meet with teachers, we would meet with the principals of the schools and give accommodations, what's going really well. And then recommendations, because we would have things that we kept calling it the Hogan lesson, because they knew when we were coming to observe, and we saw everybody talked about Hogans. And at least there was a discussion going on that had something to do with the Native community, but it wasn't enough. So when the administration changed, we were kicked out of the school. It was quite we knew it was coming because not accidentally, the district hired a specialist who had testified in Congress against bilingual education. And even though I would talk to the community and the school community, that my research showed that the most successful kids were ones who were grounded in their culture, their history, and their language. And to take away those things created another barrier. It did not help the kids, but the district felt that the reason so many young Native students were not succeeding was because of their language and their culture, even though the research showed just the opposite. There was a phone call from this bilingual specialist who accidentally sent reply all. And so we got the information as well that the district was meeting, Orrin Hatch, our senator at the time, was meeting in Washington with the Department of Justice to try to get the district out from underneath our monitoring efforts. There was nothing we could do. We went one monitoring session, and we were told that this effort had gone on longer than World War II. And we kind of thought, well, it wouldn't have been if you had been doing what you were supposed to be doing according to the court order. And what was right educationally. I mean, this is that for parents to have to go to the courts to try to get done or the kinds of things that their students needed that was supported by educational research was absurd. So that was 2002, the justification for getting out from underneath the Sin and Jenny court requirements were No Child Left Behind. What was not allowing the district to meet No Child Left Behind regulations because they were doing the Sin and Jenny. So at that point in 2002, the monitoring, and I say that probably monitoring, was taken out of our hands, and the district decided, and they created a new curriculum. Okay, that was going to include not only Navajo and Ute, it was also going to include pioneers, so that the diversity curriculum was supposed to be inclusive of everybody in the district. And so in this new curriculum, there would be things for teachers, guides saying, do a Navajo round dance, do a Ute bear dance, and do a pioneer clogging dance. And that is the curriculum that is kind of in place right now in the school district. There were other cases that came out of the Sin and Jenny as well. The Myers case created at Navajo Mountain. There's the most isolated school in Utah. In order to get to it, you had to drive into Arizona and circle around and come back into Navajo Mountain. And there were no high schools for students there. And the state of Utah argued that because that even though these kids were living in the state of Utah, but that the state had no obligations to provide educational services for them because they were on Indian land. And it was a real rejection of, even though these were citizens of the state of Utah, but using these racial dimensions to deny, once again, the same kind of educational access that white citizens enjoyed in the state. I guess let me just say what I was trying to remember a few minutes ago was Eve Tuck says we shouldn't do just damage-centered research, centered on failure, dropout rates, lack of academic achievement, but that we need to look more positive. How many kids do graduate and what positive things does a community provide for their students? When I was no longer had access to the schools to continue looking at the application of or lack of application of the court-ordered materials, I got involved in the next lawsuit. And this was a voting rights case. And some of you may be familiar with the voting rights case. It was gerrymandering so that, and this was a Navajo Nation versus San Juan County, that Navajo voters were packed into certain districts, which would dilute the Navajo influence and vote in the county. In my role as an expert witness in that case, it was looking at if you have an uneducated citizenry, it affects citizens voting or not voting. And so in arguing in that case, how did my research, what over the previous 20 years, what was in my research that might be positive in helping us understand what was going on and why the voting issues are so important and they filter into the schools. So these 7 points were brought out. One was pushing that, and that the disparities that I showed in San Juan District, which was the same disparities over all of these years, pushing academically challenged American Indian students into dropping out of school, disproportionate punishing disciplinary actions against American Indian students, vocational tracking of American Indian students, limited access to educational services, remedial curriculum, remedial reading courses, racial conflict in classrooms and schools. And I argue that the lack of academic achievement impacts civic participation. And when I say this disciplinary action, it was quite startling. And this is that the school to pipeline, and this comes out of, and so this is right at the point of when parents started the Sin and Jenny case again in '91. So nationally, 22% of American Indian students receive disciplinary actions in schools, compared to 14% of white students. So that's nationwide. American Indian students are roughly 3 times more likely to be expelled and referred to law enforcement than their white counterparts. And the disparity in Utah is even greater. In Utah, American Indian students are almost 4 times more likely to receive school disciplinary action compared to their white peers. 55 American Indian students in kindergarten through 6th grade were referred to law enforcement in 2011. Elementary school kids. In comparison, not a single white student in elementary schools in Utah received this action in the whole state. American Indian students are almost 4 times more likely to receive school disciplinary actions than their white counterparts. And American Indian students are 7.5 times more likely to be expelled compared to white students. Now, the disparity that I just shared, that is national level and state level, is even worse at the school district level. So the disparity between American Indian and white students, 2011 in the San Juan School District, Indian students who comprise 47% of the K through 12 population accounted for 80% of disciplinary actions. So we see treatment, institutionally treatment, discipline, access to non-enriched curriculum prevailing in the educational experiences in the San Juan school districts that Indian youth have been exposed to. We are now at 2022. The case is not closed. There's been interest in trying to see what's going on now. If we look at, I have test scores that go up until 2 years ago, and the academic achievement hasn't changed since the early 70s. Again, individual teachers can do an excellent job, but when you have a school district that looks at Indianness as a deficit instead of a resource to work with, you still are undermining the educational paths and opportunities of Native students. when I look back on these years, sometimes I get depressed. I think, whoa, I mean, the children of the children of the children of the children in the original lawsuit, are their experiences any better? And I have to say yes, but there's still a lot more that could be done. My hopes in, like in New Mexico, the Yazzie case, that maybe some of those lessons of what we've learned in the Sin and Ginny case, that you have to persevere. Just putting something in place doesn't mean it's going to filter down into the classrooms and into enriching the educational experience of Native kids. I guess the effort goes on. And for me as a retired professor, I'm not dead yet. And I'm excited to see the new work of graduate students that all of you are working with. And I'm looking at my colleague here, Dr. Cynthia Benali, who is kind of stepped in to keep going with some of the things that those of us before her in looking at Native education had started. That's when I'm feeling much more positive.
Well, thank you, Professor Deyhle. That was a really nice historical overview of your work. And it really, to me, it emphasized the activism that's embedded in our research, that we just don't research for ourselves, that we research for communities and for people and for social justice. And so I can't say that's always the case for every researcher, but we certainly see it in your work. So thank you very much for your lifelong contributions to all of our work. I think you heard from the people there how much we've read one or two or maybe all of your articles.
When I started, and I was saying this to Glenn about it before we started, there were so few Indigenous Native scholars in the United States, and there's so many now. And it's just so exciting. And I would just say, hang in there. I mean, if I could be doing it for 50 years, and I'm like I said, I'm not dead. I'm still in the fight. But it is a little depressing sometimes to think that we're still in the fight, in the battle. But surrounding yourself with people who are also in the good fight. That's just how I have to end it, because I have to feel positive. We can't give up. Our children are too important.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Deyhle. It was an amazing presentation. I feel like we're really lucky to have heard from you specifically, because we've read your work. And for some people, they're putting a face to the work that you produced for us. And thank you very much. And I guess we'll go ahead and call this an end for this brown bag.